Thank you for showing up this morning talk by Dr. Tony. I want to welcome him and Anuradha both from the Macquarie University, Australia, as you know, it's a top-ranked university in Australia. Let me mention about Dr. Tony. He is an associate professor of economics in the Department of Economics, Macquarie University, Sydney. He holds degrees from Australian National University and the University of Western Sydney. And after a short period working in the Commonwealth Department of Minerals and Energy in Canberra, he moved into academia. He has had visiting positions in UC Berkeley, Cambridge University in England, XLRI and Sydney University, among others. His main research interests are in the area of microeconomics, general equilibrium theory, and game theory. Professor Bryant's book, General Equilibrium, Theory and Evidence, Singapore World Scientific 2010, was very favorably reviewed in Zenith Math. That monograph contains a very careful and extended investigation of the foundations of general equilibrium. It turns up surprising and compelling conclusions about conditions necessary for the general equilibrium. And today we are very honored and proud to have a distinguished public lecture on a brief overview of a state world economy. So let us give him a very big round of applause and welcome. And over to you, Dr. Tony. Thank you.
To begin with, the definition of what an economy is. So an economy is a collection of individuals making supply and demand decisions in order to further their own interests. In economics, individuals are typically divided into consumers and producers. It's not essential, but it helps. So a state of the economy, properly defined, that is the way general economic theory types define it, is a consumption and labour supply vector for each consumer in the economy, an input-output vector for each firm in the economy, and a price vector which records the price of every commodity in the economy. The number of consumers in this economy is denoted by capital I, with a little e under it to indicate the economy we're talking about. If the number of firms is J, similarly subscripted, and the number of commodities is C, similarly subscripted, then the state of the economy is this huge list which talks about the labour supply and consumption demand for each individual, the input-output vectors for each firm, and the price for each commodity. If we think about the world as a collection, a union of economies, then the world economy is this union of all the economies in the world, and the state of the world economy is a statement about the input-output vector for each consumer in the economy across the whole world, the input-output vectors for each firm across the whole world, and the price of each commodity across the whole world. That's a massive amount of information that one needs in order to do just a description of the state of the economy. Even though it is a massive amount of information, it is nevertheless what general equilibrium theory and its applications take as the starting point. That's the objective. It's a very disaggregated point of view. And what it tries to recognise is that each individual has a different situation, typically, and each individual's situation needs to be accounted for in trying to say something about the state of the whole economy. Of course, you could add in to that basic description, you could add in things like the income and wealth position of each consumer in the economy, and add in things like the happiness of each consumer in the economy. I've got research students at the moment working on happiness indices, working on the distribution of income. You could talk about the profit situation of each firm in the economy and so on. So this description that I've got here is basic and kind of, in a sense, an obvious starting point. But it's not by any means exclusive. You you can look well beyond that to include many, many other things of relevance. Now, that way of thinking about the state of the economy is, in a sense, correct. You know? It's disaggregated, it's relevant to each individual, to each firm, to each enterprise, to each commodity. It's very, very disaggregated. It, of course, has tremendous demands at the theoretical level for modelling and also at the empirical level. Nevertheless, general equilibrium theory, general equilibrium analysis in general, tries to do this, and pause for shameless self-promotion. If you would like to have a look at the theoretical kind of approach which takes that disaggregated view, my general equilibrium book does that. And if you would like to look at the applications of the book that I've recently edited on computable general equilibrium models, it does that. This is a 30-minute lecture at most. I'm going to try your patience. And so what I'm going to do here is talk about the macroeconomic characterisation of the state of the world economy. This is not my preference in the sense that, as you'll see, I have reservations about what happens when you do macroeconomics. I love macroeconomics, by the way. It's gorgeous. But it begins by aggregating things. And as soon as you aggregate stuff, you miss a whole lot of information that's actually quite important. Nevertheless, for the sake of time and your patience and various other things, I'm not going to go down the full-on computable general equilibrium description of the world economy. Maybe at some other time, you can invite me back for 6 months, perhaps. We can go through the whole GE setup, but instead I'll talk about macroeconomics. The first thing you need to realise about macroeconomics, and I'm not being offensive here. I publish papers in macroeconomics. I love macroeconomics. One of my favourite professors, Stephen Tanofsky, a big macroeconomics theory guy. But the thing about macroeconomics, the starting point of macroeconomics, is to make up things. Right? And the things that get made up are aggregate economic variables. So macroeconomics begins with things like the inflation rate. Of course that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as the inflation. There's an inflation rate for houses, for cars, for shoes, for toothpaste, for education, etc. There's an inflation rate for each commodity. But macroeconomics finds it useful to lump them all together into a single number. That's a very useful thing to do, right? But you have to be aware that there's a distribution around that number. Some commodities have got negative inflation rates, even in an economy with positive inflation, and some have got very big positive inflation. Right. So macroeconomics begins by coming up with single numbers. The interest rate is another kind of classic example. There is, of course, no such thing as the interest rate. There are various interest rates across the economy depending on the sort of loan you want, the sort of institution you're borrowing from. The exchange rate, there's an exchange rate for large transactions, an exchange rate for smaller transactions, commercial exchange rates, tourist exchange rates, black market exchange rates, etc., etc. So macroeconomics begins by making up variables, big macro variables. And the most commonly thought about macro variable is real gross domestic product, the value of output, surveyed, estimated, guessed at. And in terms of that macro variable, I want to say a few things about the state of the world economy. So the beautiful, in my eyes beautiful, equation 1, which the GE types write down, and they say there's the world economy, the sum of, or the union of all the economies in the world. The macroeconomic version of that is this, the soccer ball, which gives you the United States economy, which of course doesn't exist beyond the 300 million people who make up the economy. But in macroeconomics, we'll talk about the United States, and we'll talk about China, and we'll talk about India, and Australia, and all the other countries that are aggregated up to form the whole world. Right? And if you look at that, you'll get things like the United States, real gross domestic product, China's real gross domestic product. These are listed in kind of order. Japan, Germany, UK, France, India, Italy, Brazil, and Canada. And this is often, this is often the first statistic that anybody encounters when talking about the world economy. Here is this big variable that tries to capture something about the output of the economy. It doesn't talk about the output of polio vaccines, it doesn't talk about the output of machine guns, it doesn't talk about the output of curd, which I'm very fond of, not so fond of machine guns, reasonably fond of polio vaccines when I was about that high, but it just talks about output. It's this one big amorphous mass of stuff and measures, sticks that number on an economy and says this is the description of this economy. Now, according to the IMF's most recent World Economic Outlook, there's a second thing which is of interest, and that is not just the level, those things are the levels of real GDP, real because you don't want price inflation to get in the way of trying to get a handle on the size of this economy and its productivity. The other thing that people get interested in are growth rates of this variable. And according to the IMF's World Economic Outlook, the most recent one, which was January 2017, China's economy grew by about 6.7%, India's economy grew by about 6.6%, the US grew by about 1.6%, and Brazil contracted by about 3.5%. So levels and growth rates are the first two variables that are typically visited when people try to characterise the state of the world economy. What I find interesting is to do something that no doubt you've all done a macroeconomics course at some stage, and you've learned the almost holy equation, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, perhaps. We've all heard of this. So that the gross domestic product of an economy plus imports gets distributed or gets stimulated in a macroeconomic way of looking at things by four big sectors. The household sector is responsible for chewing up consumption goods, typically. The firm sector, which makes demands for investment purposes. The government sector, which makes demands for its purposes, social policies, defence, strategic investments, whatever, and exports. An interesting thing to do for, and actually this is a genuine lecture, I know. I thought there was an exercise in here. Oh yes, there is. There's an exercise. Pick 5 countries at your leisure. I'm not going to be able to mark this exercise, so it's entirely anonymous system here. But an interesting thing to do is to actually pick 5 countries that you find interesting and just have a look at the percentage of growth in real GDP coming from households, coming from firms for investment purposes, coming from the government, and coming from exports. And another thing that you might also like to do is have a look at the percentage of the available consumption in the economy that comes from imports. So you might like to have a look at imports as a percentage of what's produced domestically plus imports. There's some very interesting, just as a descriptive exercise, some very interesting things to notice if you actually do that. So that's kind of snapshot of where we were. The thing that you are no doubt really interested in are forecasts. So am I. I have for many years been pushing in the economics department at Victoria University for forecasting courses to be produced. One of the beautiful things about forecasting is that there are many intriguing techniques for doing forecasting. So there's beautiful literature associated with doing forecasting. The second thing, if you plan to be a consultant or a business analyst or to work in firms or governments or whatever, the beautiful thing about forecasting is that the future is always in front of us. So there is always demand for your services if you are a forecaster. That's not true necessarily of everybody else. The third thing is that unlike if you become a surgeon or an accountant or an investment banker, if you screw up in your forecasts, everybody expects that to happen. Nobody expects you to get it right. What other sort of job could you possibly have where if you're wrong, people say, yes, well, of course you're wrong. It's the forecasting, so yes, it is. Terribly sorry. Provided you're not too wrong, and provided everybody else is about as wrong as you are, then, good, back to the drawing board, and away you go again. So forecasting, just as an aside, forecasting is something that you should think seriously about studying, both for its inherent interest and also for its applicability. It's a fascinating thing. Okay, so what does the World Bank, who employed heaps of forecasts, including some of my students, former students, what does the World Bank think about one of the forecasts that the World Bank has made? Well, they think that soccer ball will inflate by about 2.7% in size in total in 2017. The actual growth rate for the world economy measured in this very aggregate way was about 2.3% in 2016. So there's a bit of an increase. Advanced economies are forecast to grow about 1.8% in 2017 by the World Bank. And emerging and developing economies are forecast to grow at a bit over 4% in 2017, which compares with 3.4% actual. The Chinese economy, which is a major part of the developing and emerging economies story, is forecast to grow about 6.5%. That is that's quite a reduction in terms of what the Chinese economy has been doing recently. And the two sources of that are softening demand for exports and a slower growth in private investment in China. Average growth in emerging economies has declined from about 10% in 2010 to about 3.5% actual in 2016. And at the moment, investment growth is well below trend. And the reason that economists keep banging on about investment and investment growth is that weak investment growth slows capital deepening in an economy. It constrains planned urbanisation development, and it reduces the potential for the soccer ball to expand. It reduces the potential for real gross domestic product to grow. And this very general kind of level, since output growth is a major source of poverty alleviation, then that is potentially bad news. The Chinese economic situation is particularly interesting. Its imports account for about 10% of world imports. Its GDP is about 10% of world GDP, and its investment is about 20% of world investment. Investment growth in China, like a lot of other emerging and developing economies, was running at about 20% in 2012. It was 10% in 2016. And so, the question, the variable that hasn't been talked about very much is the G variable in there. Is there a role for policy, in particular monetary and fiscal policies? And so I want to show you a couple of summary statistics. I'm going to summarise the summary that macro gives us. In advanced economies, there are very low real interest rates and even negative real interest rates. There are a lot of textbooks that have had to be rewritten because in a lot of textbooks there's this thing that says there's a zero lower bound on interest rates. Interest rates can never go below zero. Often they were talking about nominal interest rates, but the implication was also real interest rates would never go below zero. So those books have been taken and those sections quietly excised. General equilibrium theorists, by the way, are not surprised by negative prices. We've been studying negative prices and negative interest rates for a very long time, so it's not a surprise to us. But it's certainly a surprise to macroeconomics and to finance. And I want to just drive that point home by showing you the following picture. So if I could get the guy with the headband to move just a little bit to his left. Yeah. The punchline is right behind nominal interest rates in the United States. The blue line starts in 1694. The current nominal interest rate, which is 0.25% in Britain, is lower than it was than it has ever been since 1694. Now, 1694 is quite a long time ago, even for somebody as old as I am. I don't remember 1694. Shakespeare possibly just remembers 1694. So this number has never in the history of the Bank of England been previously observed. And notice this is nominal interest rates. This is not real interest rates. When you take off inflation, real interest rates in the United Kingdom are negative and have been for quite some time. Similarly, in the United States, Yellen moved interest rates a 0.25% at the last board meeting, but the story is still similar. So looking at that simple macro variable, the official interest rate, the official nominal interest rate, tells you that the world economy, and again with all the caveats that I've been making about macro variables, have the real world has distributions around these macro variables. But this is a very, very unusual situation. It has never before been visited in human history. Similar second summary statistic is global inflation. So many textbooks, again, used to be very worked up about inflation. It's a terrible thing, and it is. There are all sorts of disadvantages. What was forgotten and to some extent negligently forgotten by policymakers and textbook writers and people who educated policymakers was that the Goldilocks zone is where we want to be. We don't want high inflation, but we don't want disinflation either. And disinflation is what we've got in very, very many countries around the world, particularly in Europe and in parts of the United States. So interest rates are very, very low because global growth is weak, productivity growth is weak, populations across the world are aging, protectionism is on the rise. There's a lot of talk about nationalism in the United States post-Trump. There's always a tendency to want to withdraw into one's own country. The same things are true in Australia. I'm not quite sure of the situation in India, but there are always these forces saying, if only we could keep those foreigners out, I remember having a teacher once, years and years ago at high school, and some guy was making this point, they're coming over here and taking our jobs, and this teacher said, listen, they're not going to take your job. So why not? Because you won't have one. You're not bright enough to have a job, so don't worry about it. But this retreat into domestic economies is fueled by the fact that some people do suffer from the opening of an economy to free trade. That's absolutely the case. Australia and Japan often dance around possible free trade agreements, and notionally there is a free trade agreement. But in reality, if Australia and Japan, take an example just to illustrate this point, if Australia and Japan actually signed a free trade agreement, what would happen is that Japanese agriculture would be wiped out overnight because they can't compete with the broad-scale agriculture in Australia, and Australian manufacturing, what remains of it, will be wiped out overnight. There would be aggregate gains to both economies, but the people who work in agriculture in Japan and the people who work in what's left of manufacturing in Australia will be worse off. So free trade on its own isn't a panacea, and economic theory has known this for a very long time. Free trade, or moves towards globalisation, open economies and so on, has to be accompanied by redistributive policies from the winners to the losers. Otherwise, you will get the losers making enough losers to retreat back into isolationist national policies, and we know from history how much of a disaster that is. Okay, so the final bit of this, Keynes pointed out almost 100 years ago now that you can't push a piece of string. Try, but no problem. I hope somebody is screaming this back to the CIA or whoever is listening to all our conversations these days. So Keynes pointed out you can't push a piece of string. What he was talking about was that monetary policy has a very limited role, typically. If an economy is in a recession, if businesses are reluctant to invest because they don't think they're going to be able to sell much in the future, if consumers are reluctant to buy because they're not sure they'll have a job, then cutting interest rates will be of limited value. You're not changing people's behaviour all that much. Many governments, and again I don't know what the situation is in India, but many governments in the West, Australia, Britain, some parts of Europe, the United States maybe, have become captive to what a lot of economists think of as a debt fetish. So they've taken fiscal policy, until recently taken fiscal policy off the table because they think, we'll be in debt, and this is a terrible thing. It's a fetish, and what it means is that useful policy initiatives, such as increasing investment in human capital, which is economic code for education, is not done on the scale that it needs to be done, and investment in fiscal infrastructure is not done on the scale that it needs to be done. And both of those things have productive benefits as well as immediate short-term stimulus. The Australian economy, is the only economy, the only advanced economy apparently, that avoided the GFC, the consequences of the madness that unfolded in the United States. The reason for that was that the head of the Treasury at the time said to the Prime Minister at the time, in the face of this, we need to do three things. We need a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term stimulus package. The short-term stimulus package has to target households, and the short-term stimulus package meant that households under an income of a certain amount received $900 Australian dollars, just people got checks in there. $900, terrific. Off they went and spent it. The medium term was to build extra classrooms in schools right across Australia, and the long-term stimulus was to build infrastructure, road, rail, port infrastructure. And it worked, so these Keynesian type policies of fiscal stimulus, targeted fiscal stimulus, seemed to avoid the worst of the GFC in Australia. So, my conclusion, you'll be pleased to know this is over, my conclusion is that the April IMF World Outlook is about to be published. It's not available yet, or I've used their thing, and that should provide valuable updates on the official view of the state of the world economy at this macro level, particularly with respect to the US policy direction to the extent that. And of course, I can't let this go without saying, the aggregate level picture of the world economy misses many subtleties. That's not a criticism of it, it's just a statement of fact. If you model the economy that way, you will miss things. One of the important things that the aggregate approach misses is the distribution of economic welfare. And the reason for being interested in the distribution of economic welfare is that it suggests microeconomic oriented policies and reforms associated with redistribution and better alignment of prices to actual costs of production. And that's it. So do I have to pay you?
We're opening the whole this board for the question and answer. Please feel free to ask questions.
I regard it as a tremendous privilege to have the best and the brightest of the next generation to talk to and educate. But that isn't actually the whole job. Part of the job of an academic, in my view, is to excite people with ideas, but also to give them techniques, or at least give them directions for getting techniques that will be useful to them. And very early in my career, I started asking my graduates, so what was the first thing they asked you to do? And you know, at that stage in my career, a lot of people graduating from Macquarie University were going to work for the Reserve Bank of Australia or the Treasury or some, you know, big government department, big and influential economics government department. And they said, well, you know, the first thing they asked us to do is forecast things. And I said, right, and how much preparation did you get for that? And they said, well, you know, we did a lot of microeconomic theory, we did a lot of macroeconomic theory, we did a lot of econometrics, we did a lot of public policy, we did a lot of finance, we did a lot of statistics, we did a lot of stuff. But nowhere did anybody, and in all of those things, there was an encounter with forecasting, but nowhere did people teach us in a sort of coherent way forecasting. And so, you know, being young and excitable, I went to my head of department and said, hey, guess what? You know, we really should do this. This forecasting stuff. And the head of department said, yes, of course. At lunchtime, I said, I think I'll go to lunch, and you're not invited. But it didn't go away. I guess to put it in a kind of big context, economics faced something of an apparent crisis after the Berlin Wall came down. So why would economics have an apparent crisis after the Berlin Wall comes down? Well, because there came an argument that said there used to be an argument about the design of the economic system. So there was socialism, communism represented by the Eastern Bloc, and there was capitalism represented by the United States and Britain and Europe and so on. The fall of the Berlin Wall has kind of wrapped up that debate in the sense that we now know which system works. And in fact, a guy called Francis Fukuyama published a book that some of you may have read called The End of History. And the thesis in that book, from which Fukuyama has subsequently retreated, the thesis was very interesting. And the thesis was that history has ended in the sense that we now know the answer. And the answer, according to Fukuyama, was that the way we should live at the political level is in democracies, representative democracies, and the way we should live at the economic level is in competitive market economies. And that's it, it's all over. Right? So at that point, economics had something of a crisis because economics, to a large extent, is a debate about the system. It's a debate about how we should live economically and politically. Kenneth Arrow, who's recently died, made a lot of contributions to political science as economics. And so in that context, I kept saying to people, look, and you know, footnote, at that point, a lot of economics departments and statistics departments ran around rebadging their courses with the word business in the title. So, you know, a course that was previously statistics became business statistics. And I used to ask these guys, so what's a business statistic? You know, how's that different to a statistic? Oh, you know, it's a business statistic, right? Yeah, but what's the difference? You know, does it have can you take an average of it? Yeah. A distribution? Yes. So it's a statistic, right? Derived from business rather than population. Yeah, that's right. Yes. So, and you know, there are a lot of courses called business economics and you know, business finance and so on. And to my mind, it was just silly because it was, you know, it was trying to cash in on something that you're not going to be able to cash in on it if you haven't got statistics. If you don't know how to do statistics, then calling it, you know, you might as well call it Martian statistics. Why wouldn't that work? You know, there might be Martians out there who want to get in on this stuff. We call it Martian statistics. I'm joking, so it's not a good idea. So I was, you know, by that time head of the department, and I spearheaded a resistance movement which said we will continue to teach economics, but we will teach things, we will teach proper economics, just in case the economy down the track runs into something like the global financial crisis, in which, you know, at which point people did not run around looking at business statistics, they ran around looking at statistics. You know, they forgot about all the artifacts. And so we'll teach economics, but we will teach things, we will teach it from the point of view of what people can do with it. And the two big areas in economics that I argued for in our particular department were cost-benefit analysis and forecasting. And those two big strands, cost-benefit analysis being a kind of old-fashioned word for project evaluation, and forecasting being, you know, a whole area of technique and applications. You know, it took off, and we offer courses in both of those things. And of course, in order to do those things, in order to do forecasting and cost-benefit analysis, you have to understand economics properly. You have to understand economic theory and economics. It's a bit like surgery. You know, if you're going to become a brain surgeon, that's a very sexy sort of thing, you know. Go to parties, you know, go to conferences. That's what you do, brain surgeon. That's very interesting. But to become a brain surgeon, they don't hand you a scalpel and a brain and say go for it. They teach you about the human body from the foot up. They teach you about the heart. You know, you might say, oh, I don't want to know about the heart, but I'm going to be a brain surgeon. Yeah, I'm going to be a brain surgeon. But the brain is connected to all this other stuff, and all this other stuff is connected to the brain. You have to know the whole thing. And so the pitch for knowing economics and then knowing how to do something important like forecasting or cost-benefit analysis is that there isn't a shortcut. You wouldn't let a brain surgeon operate on you who only has done courses in brain surgery. This thing cuts, that's a brain, let's go. There is no shortcut, sorry to tell you this. I know you're all young and enthusiastic and anxious. There isn't a shortcut to fundamental knowledge. And the horrible reality is that everybody has got superficial knowledge. The whole world is full of superficial, in heavily inverted commas, knowledge. The reason you're in places like this, and the reason you're subjecting yourself to degree programs and to endless lectures by guest lecturers who come, from Australia and various other places and pour the pants off you, is that you need deeper, more profound and more fundamental knowledge. That's the thing that will get you ahead. It's not the superficial stuff. So, that's a very long answer to a very short question. But think about forecasting, think about project evaluation, but most importantly, think about learning the deep, important stuff, both for the sake of your own soul and for the sake of your own ability to function at a level superior to those who have just the superficial stuff.